A little girl working in a London cafe offered a royal guard a free protein bar. He took it, nodded once, and left without a word. An hour later, she was fired behind the bins. The manager said, "You don't give handouts to statues." But what he didn't know was who that guard used to be, or how far a single nod can travel when it comes from someone trained to fly rescue missions in hostile skies. Minutes later, the cafe doors opened again. Only this time, it wasn't customers walking in, it was Royal Marines. Before we reveal what truly happened that day, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. London mornings have this way of sneaking up on you. On this particular Tuesday, fog hung low over Birdcage Walk, cobblestones slick with dampness, the air carrying that mix of wet pavement and history that clings to Westminster. Lance Corporal Tristan Hale stepped into that grey morning light with the kind of precision that comes from 18 years of never being late, never being unprepared, never letting anyone down. Mid-30s, with hands that had held rifles in places where mistakes cost lives, and shoulders that carried weight most people never see. His face had that weathered quality you get from standing in all kinds of weather and pretending it doesn't bother you. In his scarlet tunic and towering bearskin, he looked exactly like what tourists expected. Stoic, untouchable, part of the ancient machinery of tradition. What they didn't see was the slight favour he gave his left leg when he walked, a souvenir from Helmand Province that only showed up on cold mornings. Or the way his eyes constantly swept his surroundings, cataloguing exits, counting potential threats, noting things that didn't belong. Before joining the household division, Hale had been a Royal Marine Commando. He'd carried wounded mates across Afghan valleys under fire, earned ribbons that meant more than most people would understand. Now he stood watch over tourists and tradition. Different uniform, same mission, protect what matters. His rotation that morning would put him near Victoria Memorial. 3 hours of absolute stillness while crowds poked, prodded and tested his resolve with everything from whispered jokes to outright provocations. It was part of the job, part of the test. But first, protocol allowed for hydration, so he ducked into a narrow cafe tucked just off the main tourist trail. The place looked like it had been there since Churchill walked these streets. Faded blue paint, chalkboard promising London's best tea, door that stuck when opened. Inside smelled of burnt coffee, yesterday's pastries, and decades of conversation. Behind the counter stood someone who absolutely, categorically should not have been there. A girl, 12 years old at most, drowning in an oversized apron, dark hair in a slipping ponytail. She moved with careful efficiency of someone who'd learned that staying busy meant staying out of trouble. The moment Hale walked in, something changed in her posture. She straightened like a recruit hearing footsteps, alert and focused. Without a word, without even asking what he wanted, she reached for a paper cup and filled it with steaming hot water. Not tea, not coffee, just water. Hot, clean, simple. "No charge," she said simply, offering it with both hands in a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial. Hale accepted it with a single nod. The water was perfect, hot enough to warm him, not so hot it would scald. As he turned to leave, she quietly placed a wrapped protein bar on the counter beside the register. "You dropped this," she said. A lie, told with the kind of gentle kindness that made it feel like truth. He looked at it for a long moment, not the bar itself, but what it represented. Someone seeing he might be hungry, someone caring enough to risk trouble for a stranger. He took it without fuss and walked out, the door chiming softly behind him. From somewhere in the back of the cafe came a voice like sandpaper scraping concrete. "Ella, what did I tell you about bloody freebies?" The girl, Ella, flinched as if she'd been slapped but said nothing. She went back to wiping down surfaces with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that moving meant surviving, that being useful meant being tolerated, that drawing attention meant trouble. Neil Strathmore emerged from the back room like a storm cloud in a bad mood. Mid-40s, thinning hair slicked back, the permanent scowl of a man convinced the world was conspiring against him. Not evil exactly, just small, petty, mistaking meanness for strength. "What was that about?" he demanded, still drying his hands on a towel that had definitely seen better decades. "I saw you talking to that tin soldier." Ella kept wiping the counter, focusing on a spot that was already spotless. "Just gave him water, sir." "And?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "A protein bar." Neil's laugh was sharp and humorless, like glass breaking. "You gave it to him for free, just handed over stock like you own the place." He looked like he hadn't eaten. He's been standing out there for hours. He looked like... Neil stepped closer, voice rising with each word. "You think this is a charity shop? You think I'm running a bloody soup kitchen for toy soldiers playing dress-up?" Ella stopped wiping. "No, sir." "Then explain to me why you're handing out my food to strangers. Explain to me why you think you have the right to give away things that cost me money." "He's not a stranger. He's a Royal Guard. He protects..." "He's a bloke in a costume with a big hat and a stick. That's it. And you just cost me money because you wanted to play Mother Teresa." The few customers scattered around the cafe were starting to notice now, conversations trailing off. An elderly couple looked uncomfortable. A businessman glanced up. A young mother quietly headed for the door. Neil didn't care. If anything, he seemed to feed off the attention, growing larger and louder with each passing second. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, stepping close enough that she had to look up. "You think being nice matters. You think if you smile and hand out freebies, people will remember you. Well, nobody remembers the girl behind the counter. Nobody cares if you're kind or cruel. They care about their coffee and getting out of here." Ella stood perfectly still, like a small animal, hoping a predator wouldn't notice it. "I should fire you right now," Neil went on, warming to his theme. "Pack your little bag and send you back to whatever council estate you crawled out of. But I'm feeling generous today. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay for that bar out of today's wages, all of today's wages, and you're never going to talk to those guards again. You're never going to hand out so much as a napkin without asking me first. Clear?" "Yes, sir." But something in her voice had changed, gone flat, distant, like she'd stepped back inside herself and closed the door. Neil didn't notice. He was already turning away, muttering about bleeding hearts and handouts and kids these days who don't understand the value of money. The cafe gradually returned to normal volume, but the atmosphere had curdled. The businessman left early and Ella went back to wiping surfaces that didn't need wiping. Outside, Lance Corporal Tristan Hale took his position and became a statue. For the next 3 hours, he didn't move a muscle. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed and giggled, adults made jokes about whether he was real. One teenager waved his hand in front of Hale's face. None of it mattered. Hale had stood motionless through sandstorms in Afghanistan and monsoons in Brunei, maintained his post while mortars fell nearby. A few tourists with camera phones weren't going to break his concentration. But behind that ceremonial stillness, his mind was working. He'd clocked the girl's age, definitely under 16. Her demeanour, the way she'd moved with exhausted efficiency, the careful way she'd offered that cup, the protein bar given with such quiet generosity. And when his shift ended and he walked past the cafe again on his way back to barracks, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The back alley behind the cafe. Ella, standing by the bins, clutching a plastic carrier bag and school backpack. Neil in front of her, red-faced and yelling. Neil stood in front of her, red-faced and gesticulating wildly, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "Should have fired you the day I found you," Neil was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the narrow alley. "But no, I felt sorry for you. Thought I was doing a good deed, giving some poor kid a chance. Biggest mistake I ever made." Ella said nothing. just stood there holding her pathetic collection of belongings while this grown man towered over her, spitting venom about her failures. "You embarrassed me in front of customers, made me look weak. You think you can run your own charity out of my cafe? You think you're some kind of saint, handing out food like you're feeding the poor?" Still nothing. She might as well have been carved from stone. "And don't think you can go crying to anyone about this," Neil went on, warming up again. "Who's going to believe you? Who's going to take the word of some kid against a legitimate businessman? You're nothing. You're nobody. And after today, you'll stay nobody." He held out his hand, fingers snapping impatiently. "Keys." She fumbled in her pocket and produced a set of cafe keys attached to a ring shaped like a cartoon cat, faded from wear and time. Her hands were shaking as she held them out. He snatched them, like he was afraid she might change her mind. "Nobody's going to remember you, girl. Nobody cares about the kid who couldn't follow simple rules. You'll disappear, and it'll be like you were never here at all." Ella turned and walked away without a word. No tears, no protests. No dramatic declarations, just the mechanical movement of someone who'd learned that crying in public only made things worse, that fighting back only brought more pain, that sometimes the only dignity left was in how quietly you could disappear. Hale watched from the shadows of the adjacent building until she was completely out of sight, her small figure swallowed by the crowds of tourists and commuters who flowed past without sparing her a glance. Then he turned and walked back toward Wellington Barracks with the same measured pace he'd maintained for 18 years of military service. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Something that had nothing to do with protocol or procedure or the chain of command, and everything to do with the simple fact that some things were just wrong and needed to be made right. Back at the barracks, the locker room smelled of boot polish, and that particular military combination of soap and discipline. Sergeant Owen Radley was sitting on a bench, cleaning his ceremonial sword when Hale walked in, still wearing his full-dress uniform, but moving with the subtle looseness that meant duty was done for the day. Radley and Hale had history from Afghanistan, a bond that doesn't require many words. "You're late," Radley observed. "Wasn't rushing," Hale replied, beginning the careful process of removing his bearskin and storing it with the reverence due to something that had stood watch over Britain for centuries. Radley glanced up. He knew that tone. "What happened?" Hale told him. Not everything. That wasn't his way. But enough. A girl working illegally in a cafe. 12 years old, maybe 13. Fired for showing kindness to a soldier. A manager who thought cruelty was just good business sense. Radley listened without interruption, continuing to polish his sword while his friend spoke. When Hale finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute, not awkward, just thoughtful. Then Radley set down his cleaning cloth and reached for his secure phone. "Who are you calling?" Hale asked, though he already knew. "People who need to know," Radley replied simply. "People who can do something about it." The call went through 3 rings before a crisp voice answered. "MOD, Civil Enforcement, Captain Harland speaking." "Ma'am, this is Sergeant Radley, Wellington Barracks. I have a civilian welfare situation that requires immediate attention. Unlicensed child labour, retaliatory dismissal, possible exploitation." A pause. "Go ahead, Sergeant." Radley laid out the facts with military precision. Location, approximate age of the victim, nature of the violation, witness testimony from a reliable source. He didn't mention names, didn't embellish, just presented the situation in terms that would make it impossible to ignore. "How certain are you of these details, Sergeant?" "Completely certain, ma'am. Source is Lance Corporal Tristan Hale, former Royal Marine, exemplary service record. He witnessed the dismissal personally." Another pause, longer this time. "I know that name. Afghanistan?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'll handle this personally. Thank you, Sergeant." The line went dead. Radley pocketed his phone and went back to cleaning his sword as if nothing had happened. "That's it?" Hale asked. That's it, Radley confirmed. Sophie Harland doesn't mess about. If she says she'll handle it, she'll handle it. Within the hour, Captain Sophie Harland was reviewing the file in her office at MOD Community Enforcement. She'd heard of Hale, former Marine, exemplary service record, the kind of soldier who saw everything and said nothing unless it mattered. The fact that he'd broken his usual silence meant this mattered. A lot. She pulled up Neil Strathmore's file. No previous violations, but that didn't mean much. She cross-referenced the address with local records. No youth employment permits on file. No indication any one official knew a child was working there. "Get me Corporal Vaughan," she told her assistant, "and coordinate with Royal Military Police for a formal response. I want 2 Marines in dress uniform for this one." The assistant looked up from her desk. "Full formal response, ma'am." "Full formal response," Harland confirmed. "Sometimes you need to make a point." By late afternoon, the cafe was enjoying its usual post-lunch lull. A handful of customers scattered around mismatched tables, the kind of Tuesday crowd that wasn't in any hurry to be anywhere else. Neil was behind the register, counting the day's takings with the satisfied air of a man who thought he'd solved a problem by making it disappear. That's when the door opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 3 figures entered, and they might as well have been carrying a banner that read "Official Business." Captain Harland led the way, her MOD uniform crisp enough to cut glass, followed by 2 Royal Marines in dress blues who filled the narrow cafe like they'd been designed for intimidating people in small spaces. Every conversation in the room stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Neil looked up from his till and immediately knew this wasn't about coffee or pastries or anything else he sold. This was about trouble, and trouble had just walked in, wearing official uniforms and serious expressions. "Mr. Neil Strathmore?" Harland's voice was polite, but carried the kind of authority that made smart people nervous and stupid people defensive. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" Neil's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "We're investigating a civilian welfare incident related to this establishment. I need you to step away from the counter and remain where I can see you, please." Neil's laugh was too loud and too forced. "Welfare incident? If this is about that girl, she quit. Walked out on her own. I've got nothing to do with whatever story she's telling. Step away from the counter, Mr. Strathmore." Corporal Vaughan stepped forward with a leather portfolio that looked official enough to part the Red Sea. His voice was calm as carved stone when he spoke. "By order of MOD, Civil Enforcement and Royal Military Police, this premises is subject to immediate investigation under Youth Labour Protection Code 73B and Civil Employment Statute 19C. You are not under arrest at this time. You are under formal investigation." The cafe fell silent except for the persistent hiss of the espresso machine, which suddenly sounded loud enough to wake the dead. "Investigation for what?" Neil demanded, his voice climbing toward panic. "I run a legitimate business here. I pay my taxes. I follow the rules." "Do you?" Vaughan opened his portfolio and removed a clipboard thick with official forms. "How old was your most recent employee, Mr. Strathmore?" "I don't have to answer that." "Actually, you do. How old was she?" Neil's eyes darted around the cafe, looking for support that wasn't coming. The customers were all staring now, phones discreetly appearing as people realized they might be witnessing something worth recording. 12, he said finally. "Maybe 13. What does it matter? She was mature for her age, worked hard. Do you have a youth employment permit for a 12-year-old worker?" Silence. "Do you have supervision protocols in place for underage employees?" More silence. "Do you have educational support documentation, parental consent forms, limited hours agreements?" Neil's face was cycling through shades of red that suggested his blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. "She didn't need all that bureaucratic nonsense. It was just part-time work, helping out." "Mr. Strathmore," Harland interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to difficult children. "Employing a 12-year-old child without proper documentation isn't helping out." It's illegal. Firing her for showing kindness to a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces isn't business. It's cruel. And both of those things are going to have consequences. The two Marines had been standing silent as statues, but now they began moving through the cafe with efficient professionalism. One photographed the work area, the other examined employee records in a filing cabinet. "You can't just search my property," Neil protested. "I know my rights. You can consent to our investigation, or we can secure a warrant and shut you down while we wait for it," Vaughan replied, without looking up from his clipboard. "Your choice." Neil opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The fight went out of him all at once, like air escaping from a punctured balloon. "Fine, whatever. You'll find she was a good worker. Reliable. I gave her a chance when nobody else would." "You exploited a child," Harlan said simply. "And when she showed basic human decency to a soldier, you punished her for it. That's not giving someone a chance. That's taking advantage of someone who had no other options." That's when the door opened again, and a new voice joined the conversation. "Actually, she does have other options now." Everyone turned to see a woman in civilian clothes holding the hand of a familiar small figure. Ella stood beside the MOD welfare officer, wearing a new coat that actually fit her, and looking like she'd been fed a proper meal for the first time in weeks. Neil's face went white. "What's she doing here?" "She's here to collect her final wages and sign some paperwork," the welfare officer replied calmly. "Standard procedure when employment irregularities are discovered." Ella looked around the cafe with the detached curiosity of someone visiting a place from their past. Her eyes lingered on the counter where she'd spent so many hours, the espresso machine she'd learned to operate despite being far too young for such work, the window where she used to watch tourists and wonder what their lives were like. "I don't owe her anything," Neil said quickly. "She walked out. That's abandonment of employment." "Actually," Vaughan said, consulting his forms, "termination of an unlicensed minor employee requires specific protocols. Since you didn't follow any of them, she's entitled to full compensation for all hours worked, plus additional damages for unlawful dismissal." He named a figure that made Neil's eyes bulge. "I don't have that kind of money." "Then you'll need to make arrangements," Harlan said. "The Ministry of Defence takes a very dim view of people who exploit children, particularly when those children show kindness to our personnel. We'll be ensuring that Ella receives everything she's entitled to, plus assistance in finding appropriate legal employment." Ella spoke for the first time since entering the cafe, her voice quiet but clear. "I don't want to cause trouble. I just wanted to help." The room fell silent. Even Neil seemed to deflate slightly at the simple dignity in her words. "You didn't cause trouble, sweetheart," Harlan said gently. "You showed kindness to someone who deserved it. The trouble was already here." One of the Marines approached Vaughan with a thick folder of documents. "Sir, we've found multiple irregularities. No employment permits, no tax documentation for underage workers, no safety protocols. Also found evidence that wages were being withheld on multiple occasions." Neil slumped against the wall, like a man watching his entire world collapse around him. "She was just a kid. I was trying to help." "No," Ella said quietly, looking directly at him for the first time. "You were trying to use me. There's a difference." The investigation took another hour. When it was finished, the cafe was sealed with temporary MOD closure notices. Neil was facing multiple violations and substantial fines, and Ella was sitting in the back of an official car with a folder full of paperwork that would set her up with legal employment, educational support, and proper oversight. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked back one last time at the cafe that had been both her lifeline and her prison for so many months. She didn't feel angry exactly, just sad for the man who'd been so afraid of losing what little he had that he'd forgotten how to be human. Meanwhile, Lance Corporal Tristan Hale had returned to his ceremonial post for the evening rotation. Same position, same perfect stillness, same unwavering attention to duty. But something fundamental had changed in the way people looked at him. Word had spread through the crowd. This was the guard the girl had helped, the one who'd helped her back. They watched him now with something approaching reverence, understanding that the man inside the uniform had a sense of right and wrong and the courage to act on it. A teenager with her phone out whispered to her friend, "That's him, isn't it? The one from the café." Her friend nodded, lowering her own phone respectfully. "My dad says, sometimes the quietest people make the loudest statements." An elderly gentleman removed his hat as he passed, a gesture of respect that rippled through the crowd until dozens of people were standing bareheaded in the cooling evening air. Hale noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but his expression never changed, his posture never shifted. He stood guard the way he always had, absolutely, completely, without compromise. The only difference was that now everyone understood what he was really guarding. Not just tradition or ceremony or tourist attractions. He was guarding the idea that kindness should be protected, that cruelty should have consequences, that someone would always be watching out for people who couldn't watch out for themselves. As the sun set over London and the streetlights began to flicker on along Birdcage Walk, Ella appeared at the edge of the crowd. She stood there for a long moment, looking across the street at the motionless figure in red, who had seen her when no one else bothered to look. Then she raised her hand in the briefest of waves, not dramatic, not attention-seeking, just a small gesture of gratitude from one person to another. Hale couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't acknowledge her while on duty, but somehow everyone watching felt like he had. Felt like he'd seen her wave and approved and promised silently that she would never be invisible again. Later, when someone asked him about what he'd done, Hale would say simply, "I did my job." But his job wasn't just standing still in a red coat and funny hat. His job was seeing what others missed, protecting what mattered, standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, noticing the small acts of kindness that made the world worth guarding in the first place, even when, especially when, nobody was watching. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Sometimes they're fought with phone calls and paperwork and the quiet determination to ensure that doing the right thing doesn't get punished. And sometimes a single act of decency, a free protein bar offered with genuine kindness, a concerned observation passed along to the right people, a system that actually works when good people use it properly, can ripple outward in ways you never expected. 3 months later, Ella sent Hale a letter through official channels. She was working part-time at an MOD youth centre, going to school, learning that not all adults were like Neil. She was still shy, but beginning to understand that kindness wasn't weakness. She never saw the guard again after that evening wave, but she kept the memory of his quiet strength, his willingness to act when needed. And sometimes, helping younger kids at the centre, she tried to stand straighter, watch more carefully, be someone who noticed when people needed help. Neil's Café never reopened. The building became a proper tea shop, run by a family who followed employment law. The new owners kept a small plaque reading "Kindness always welcome." And Lance Corporal Tristan Hale continued to stand his post, watching over London with the same vigilance that once protected his mates in Afghanistan. Because that's what guards do. They see everything, protect everyone. Remember that their real job isn't ceremony, but making sure someone is always watching, always caring, always ready to step forward when needed, even if they have to break a little protocol to do it. What would you have done in that cafe? Would you have noticed what Hale noticed? If you saw a child being mistreated at work, would you stay silent or speak up? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one, and we learn something from each of your stories. If this reminded you that small acts of kindness can have enormous consequences, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about courage, duty, and the quiet heroes who stand among us every day. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting for you right here. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another tale of honour, service, and the moments that define who we really are when nobody's watching.